Dear learners, welcome back to WSE True Stories, where English learning becomes an unforgettable adventure. Today, you are about to witness a journey unlike any other. A story of unwavering faith, of thunderous courage, and of a voice that echoed through the mountains of injustice to awaken the soul of a nation. This is not just the tale of a man. It is the story of a dream. A dream that dared to challenge centuries of oppression, a dream that stood tall even when met with fire hoses, prison bars, and death threats. A dream that ultimately helped reshape the course of American history. His name? Martin Luther King Jr. A pastor, a philosopher, a father, a fighter, and above all, a dreamer who believed that love could conquer hate, and that light would always outshine darkness. But Martin's journey was far from easy. He didn't start as a hero. He wasn't born into glory. He was a child in a divided America, where even a drink from the wrong fountain could bring humiliation, where skin color decided your destiny. And yet, he rose. He rose to inspire a movement, to unite a people, and to shake the conscience of a nation. This story will improve your English. But more than that, it will awaken your heart. Get ready for one of the most powerful and motivational stories of all time. Let's begin the journey of Martin Luther King Jr., the pastor who dared to dream. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia, a city that, like much of America at the time, was deeply divided by racial segregation. The world into which he entered was not a fair one. From the schools children could attend to the seats they could take on a bus, everything was determined by the color of your skin. His father, Martin Luther King Sr., was a Baptist minister and a strong voice in the black community. He preached with power, led with dignity, and refused to bow to the racism around him. His mother, Alberta Williams King, came from a proud and educated family of church leaders and school teachers. Together, they gave young Martin a home filled with love, discipline, and faith. But outside the safety of his home, the world told a different story. As a boy, Martin had a white friend he played with almost every day. But when they both turned 6, the friend's parents forbade them from playing together. Why? Because Martin was black. The pain of that rejection cut deep into his heart. He later said, "It was the first time I had ever been so deeply hurt." Still, Martin's family never allowed bitterness to grow. His parents taught him that he was just as good as anyone else. That his mind was sharp, his voice powerful, and his future limitless. Every Sunday, young Martin sat in the pews of Ebenezer Baptist Church, watching his father preach with fire in his voice and justice in his words. It was there that the seed of leadership was planted. But beyond the church walls, black Americans lived under Jim Crow laws, a cruel system of legal segregation. They were denied the right to vote, the right to fair education, and even the right to walk freely in certain parts of town. Lynchings still occurred. Police turned a blind eye to white violence. And yet, black voices were often silenced. Still, change was quietly growing. In the early 20th century, organizations like the NAACP had begun fighting for civil rights. Black newspapers reported injustices. Black educators opened schools. Black churches became centers of resistance. Into this world of pain and promise, a boy named Martin grew, shaped by faith, stirred by injustice, and destined for something far greater than even he could imagine. Because as he studied the Bible and read the words of Jesus, he also read the teachings of Gandhi, learning about nonviolence and soul force. A fire had begun to burn inside him. But that fire would soon face its first true test. As Martin Luther King Jr. grew older, the world around him grew more unjust. The deeper he stepped into the streets of the American South, the more he saw the scars left by centuries of racism. It wasn't just about being treated differently, it was about being treated as less than human. By the time Martin reached high school, he had begun to think deeply about life's biggest questions. Why do people hate? Why do some people suffer while others remain silent? His father had always taught him that silence in the face of injustice was itself a form of evil. And Martin couldn't ignore what he saw. He watched as black people were forced to give up seats on buses, even if they paid the same fare. He saw them enter restaurants through back doors, drink from separate fountains, and live in poor neighborhoods not by choice, but by law. One memory would haunt him for years. While traveling with a teacher for a debate competition, Martin was told to give up his seat on a bus to a white passenger. He had to stand for hours, humiliated, even though he was wearing a suit and carrying books in his hand. He had spoken like a scholar that day in competition, yet society treated him like he was invisible. Despite the daily insults, Martin pushed forward. He entered Morehouse College at just 15 years old, a rare opportunity, especially for a young black man. Surrounded by great thinkers, he began to find his voice. Yet something still troubled him. He had grown up in the church. His father was a preacher. His grandfather had been a preacher. But Martin wasn't sure he wanted to follow the same path. He wasn't interested in preaching just for tradition's sake. He wanted to do something. He wanted to change the world. That's when he met Dr. Benjamin Mays, the president of Morehouse and a powerful speaker himself. Mays told Martin something that stayed with him forever. You live in a world where you must not only love justice, but you must fight for it. Martin was inspired. Maybe the pulpit wasn't a cage, maybe it was a platform. Maybe preaching wasn't just about saving souls, maybe it was about saving society. After Morehouse, Martin continued his education at Crozer Theological Seminary, and later at Boston University, where he earned his doctorate in theology. He studied the lives of prophets, philosophers, and leaders. But most of all, he studied nonviolence, and it spoke to him like nothing else. The idea that love could be a weapon, that truth could be armor, that you could win by refusing to hate, it was bold, revolutionary, and dangerous. But to Martin, it was beautiful. Still, even with all his knowledge, there was a burning question in his heart. How could one man stand against an entire system? Was it possible to fight without fists? To rise without rage? He didn't yet have the answer. But soon, life would give him a reason to find one. Because just as he settled into his first role as a pastor in Montgomery, Alabama, a woman refused to give up her seat on a bus. And that moment would change everything. It was December 1st, 1955. The evening was quiet in Montgomery, Alabama, but something powerful was about to happen, something that would ripple through history. Rosa Parks, a 42-year-old black seamstress, was riding home on a segregated bus when the driver ordered her to give up her seat to a white man. She politely refused. Calm, dignified, unshaken, she was arrested. To some, it was just another day of injustice. But to others, it was the final straw. Enough was enough. The black community in Montgomery was ready to rise, but they needed a leader. That leader would be Martin Luther King Jr. At just 26 years old, Martin was barely known outside his church. He had no political experience, no large following. But he had a voice, deep, resonant, and full of conviction. And he had a belief that love was stronger than fear, and unity more powerful than hate. He was asked to help lead the Montgomery bus boycott, a protest that aimed to shut down the bus system through peaceful resistance. The plan? For every black person, who made up the majority of the ridership, to stop riding the buses. Martin knew the risks. People had been lynched for less. But he also knew this was a moment he couldn't ignore. He stood before a crowd of over 5,000 people at Holt Street Baptist Church and delivered a speech that electrified the room. We have no alternative but to protest. For many years, we have shown an amazing patience. But we come here tonight to be saved from that patience that makes us patient with anything less than freedom and justice. The boycott began the next morning. It was more than just an inconvenience, it was a movement. Black men and women walked for miles to work. Carpools were organized with military-like precision. Shoes were worn thin. Yet spirits remained high. The white power structure was furious. Martin's phone rang constantly with threats. "We're going to blow up your house," one caller said. Another shouted racial slurs. The police harassed him, arrested him on flimsy charges, and tried to break his will. But he did not stop. Then, one night, it happened. While he was at a meeting, someone threw a bomb into his home. His wife Coretta and their baby daughter Yolanda were inside. By some miracle, they were unharmed. Martin rushed home to see the front of the house in ruins. A crowd had gathered, some were shouting, some ready for revenge. They were angry, afraid, and rightfully outraged. But Martin raised his hand. The crowd fell silent. We must meet hate with love. We must meet physical force with soul force. We must not retaliate with violence. Even as his own family was targeted, even as the threat to his life grew every day, Martin held firm to nonviolence. The boycott lasted 381 days. In the end, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that segregation on public buses was unconstitutional. It was a major victory, not just legally, but symbolically. For the first time, a community had risen together and changed the law through peaceful protest. Martin had stepped onto the national stage. No longer just a preacher from Atlanta, he had become the face of a revolution. But this was just the beginning. He had seen what was possible. He had tasted victory. But with that victory came attention. And with attention came danger. A storm was coming, one more violent and vast than anything he had ever faced. By 1957, Martin Luther King Jr. had become a national symbol of nonviolent resistance. He was invited to speak across the country. His words moved crowds, filled churches, and inspired a rising generation of Black Americans who had long been told to sit down, be quiet, and accept their place. But Martin told them something new. You are somebody. You are worthy. You are free, and no man can take that away. He co-founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, a new organization aimed at coordinating civil rights efforts across the South. The goal, to use faith and nonviolent protest as tools to break the chains of segregation. But with each march, each speech, and each protest, the threats against him grew darker. The FBI, led by J. Edgar Hoover, labeled him a troublemaker. Agents bugged his phones, followed his family, and tried to discredit him. White supremacists burned crosses on his lawn. His mailbox overflowed with hate mail. Still, he pressed forward. Then came Birmingham, Alabama, a city known as the most segregated in America. In 1963, King and the SCLC planned a major campaign there to challenge the brutal system of racial apartheid that ruled the city. It would be one of the most dangerous moves of his life. Birmingham was run by Eugene Bull Connor, a man whose name would go down in infamy. As Commissioner of Public Safety, Connor wielded fire hoses and attacked dogs like weapons of war. His police force used violence as a language of control. Martin knew the risks. But he believed that if they could awaken the conscience of the nation by showing its cruelty, real change could come. The plan: peaceful protests, sit-ins, marches, all led by the language of love, even when met with fists and fire. As expected, the city cracked down hard. Protesters were beaten and arrested. Children were thrown in jail. And eventually, Martin himself was arrested and locked in a dark, dirty jail cell. It was there, behind bars, that he would write one of the most powerful documents in American history, the letter from Birmingham jail. Responding to white clergymen who had called his protests unwise and untimely, Martin wrote with calm fury, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor, it must be demanded by the oppressed." His words, written on scraps of newspaper and smuggled out by lawyers, would soon circle the globe. Outside the jail, something unexpected happened. Hundreds of children began marching in the streets. Teenagers. Even 8-year-olds. They sang freedom songs, carried signs, and demanded dignity. Bull Connor responded with horror. Television cameras captured the shocking images: fire hoses knocking children to the ground, police dogs biting at innocent legs, officers dragging screaming boys and girls into paddy wagons. The world watched in horror. Those images did what speeches alone could not. They pierced the conscience of a nation. Newspapers that once ignored the struggle were now forced to take notice. Ordinary Americans, North and South, were shaken to their core. Martin was released from jail. His mission in Birmingham had done its job. Soon after, President John F. Kennedy, who had once been cautious about civil rights, introduced a bill to end segregation once and for all. Birmingham changed everything. But for Martin, it was a bittersweet victory. He had seen children suffer. He had felt the cold steel of a jail cell. And he knew that even greater trials lay ahead. Because while laws could be written, hearts took longer to change. And the fight for equality, true, deep equality, was far from over. Still, the movement was rising. A dream was taking shape. And soon, that dream would be spoken aloud from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, to a crowd of hundreds of thousands, and to the soul of America itself. The summer of 1963 was heavy with hope and fear. After the flames of Birmingham, the civil rights movement stood at a crossroads. Progress had been made, but deep resistance remained. Across the South, churches were still bombed. Black families still faced daily terror. And politicians in Washington whispered, stalled, and delayed. Martin Luther King Jr. knew that a bold move was needed. Something big. Something the whole world couldn't ignore. That move became the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The idea was daring: bring together people from every state, every color, every faith, to stand before the nation's capital and demand justice. Not in anger, but in unity. Not with violence, but with faith and song. On August 28, 1963, over 250,000 people filled the National Mall in Washington, D.C., one of the largest peaceful protests in American history. They stood shoulder to shoulder, sweating in the summer sun, holding signs, clasping hands, waiting. And then, Martin stepped up to the podium. What came next would echo across generations. His speech was powerful from the beginning. But it was near the end, unscripted, from the soul, that he spoke the words that would define not just a movement, but a nation's conscience. I have a dream. A dream that his children would not be judged by the color of their skin but by the content of their character. A dream of justice, of brotherhood, of peace. A dream where every valley would be lifted, every hill made low, every voice raised in harmony. The crowd erupted. Tears fell. History was made. But even as Martin stood in triumph, danger circled like a shadow. That very same year, just 18 days after the March on Washington, tragedy struck. On September 15, 1963, 4 little girls were killed when a bomb exploded at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, a place where civil rights meetings had been held, where children sang in the choir, where hope had taken root. It was a moment that broke hearts across the nation. And it nearly broke Martin's too. He cried. He prayed. He questioned. Was this movement worth the lives of children? Could nonviolence ever reach men filled with so much hate? But even in his sorrow, he stood tall. At the funeral, he didn't preach vengeance. He spoke of sacrifice. Of the power of love to overcome death. Of the need to continue the struggle, not with bitterness, but with unbreakable courage. Still, the weight was crushing. The FBI continued its campaign against him. They mailed him anonymous letters, trying to intimidate him into silence. They spread rumors, tried to drive a wedge between him and his supporters. He was exhausted. His family was constantly at risk. And as the Vietnam War escalated, Martin faced a painful choice. He had long focused on racial justice, but now his heart ached for peace beyond the borders of America. The war in Vietnam, he believed, was immoral, a tragedy for both the Vietnamese people and the young black soldiers dying overseas. Many begged him not to speak out. You'll lose support, they warned. The president will turn against you. Civil rights will suffer. But Martin answered with the clarity of conscience. A time comes when silence is betrayal. He publicly condemned the war, in sermons, in speeches, at great political cost. Suddenly, allies became critics. Even some in the movement questioned his choice. Funding was lost. Invitations were withdrawn. The media turned cold. And yet, Martin stood firm. Because for him, justice was never about convenience. It was about conviction. Nonviolence was not just a tactic. It was a way of life, and it demanded consistency, no matter the cost. But that cost was rising. By 1968, Martin was not just fighting for civil rights, he was fighting for economic justice. He launched the Poor People's Campaign, calling for better wages, housing, education, for Americans of every race. He was preparing to march on Washington again, but this time, not just for black lives, but for all who were oppressed. And that bold vision would be his final mission. Because in April of that year, Martin traveled to Memphis, Tennessee, to support striking sanitation workers who were being paid poverty wages. There, on the night of April 3rd, he stood before a crowd and gave what would become his final sermon. I've been to the mountain top. I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you. But we, as a people, will get to the promised land. The next evening, as he stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, a single bullet ended his life. But it could not kill his dream. April 4th, 1968. As the sun set over Memphis, a wave of grief swept across the United States, and far beyond. Martin Luther King Jr., the preacher from Atlanta who had moved the world with his dream, was gone. News of his assassination shattered communities. Cities across America erupted in riots. Tears fell in black churches. Candles were lit on quiet street corners. And in homes everywhere, silence replaced hope, if only for a moment. But even in death, Martin's message refused to die. Because a seed had been planted. And it had taken root in the hearts of millions. In the days that followed, something extraordinary happened. People did not retreat into fear. Instead, they marched. Peacefully. With dignity. Holding signs that read "Honor King, End Racism." The sanitation workers in Memphis, the very reason Martin had gone to Tennessee, finally won their right to unionize and receive fairer wages. One small battle, won through his final stand. And then, just 1 week after his assassination, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1968, also known as the Fair Housing Act. It outlawed discrimination in housing, a major final piece of legislation that Martin had long demanded. His voice may have been silenced, but his dream marched on. In the years that followed, the walls of segregation crumbled further. Schools that had once been closed to black children were integrated. Voting rights were gradually protected. Black Americans began to be elected to office at all levels of government. His speeches were studied in classrooms. His words quoted by presidents. His strategies of nonviolence adopted by freedom fighters around the globe, from South Africa to India, from Poland to Palestine. And then, in 1983, something once unthinkable happened. The United States Congress voted to create a national holiday in his honor. Martin Luther King Jr. Day would be celebrated every third Monday of January, around the time of his birthday, becoming a time for reflection, service, and unity. Children who had never known segregation would now learn about the man who stood up when so many bowed down. But Martin's true victory was not just in changing laws. It was in changing hearts. He showed a divided, angry, and fearful nation that love is a force more radical than hate, that to stand firm without lifting a fist can shake empires. He proved that faith, when paired with courage, can walk straight into fire and come out singing. And he gave voice to the voiceless, not only with his speeches, but through his deep belief that every person matters. To the poor, he said, "You are not invisible." To the oppressed, "You are not alone." To the children of the future, "You are heirs to a dream, now carry it forward." His journey was not without failure. Not without pain. Not without setbacks. But his life, though short, carried more weight than 1,000 lifetimes. Martin didn't live to see all the victories he fought for. But because of him, generations would rise who could believe in their worth. Because of him, people could sit where they once were told to stand, speak where they once had to whisper, and dream loudly. Still, as powerful as his victories were, the struggle was not over. The dream, beautiful and bold, was now in the hands of others. In your hands. In mine. Because as Martin once said, freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. And so, the question remained. What would we do with the dream he left behind? Martin Luther King Jr. is remembered for many things: his thunderous voice, his unmatched eloquence, his courage in the face of terror. But his true legacy lies not just in what he did, but in what he believed. He believed that every human life carried dignity, that worth was not something granted by law or status, but something each soul was born with. He believed that nonviolence was not weakness, but strength of the highest order, the kind of strength that could stare down hatred and respond with mercy. He believed in the transforming power of love, not as a soft ideal, but as a tool of resistance, a weapon of justice. His journey was never about achieving personal glory. He never ran for office. He never sought wealth. He lived under constant threat. He knew his life might be cut short. And yet, he gave everything, because he believed the cause was worth more than comfort. From the Montgomery bus boycott to the March on Washington. From the jail cells of Birmingham to the stormy mountaintop in Memphis. Martin lived what he preached. And that is why his message still echoes today. Because the issues he fought for, justice, equality, peace, are still with us. Racism hasn't vanished. Inequality hasn't disappeared. The struggle continues, sometimes quieter, sometimes louder, but always present. And so, the lesson he left us is this. You don't need to be powerful to make change. You don't need to be famous, or wealthy, or perfect. You just need conviction, and the courage to follow it. Martin was not a superhero. He was a pastor. A father. A man with doubts and fears. But he refused to let fear rule him. He said yes to a calling, and through his yes, the world changed. Today, we remember his legacy not just with statues or holidays, but by asking ourselves, am I standing up for what's right? Am I speaking when others are silent? Am I carrying the dream forward? Because Martin once stood alone. But he dreamed of a day when none of us would have to. He showed us the mountaintop. Now, it is up to us to climb. Dear learners, thank you for walking this unforgettable journey with us. We've traveled through the pain, the passion, and the purpose of one of history's most extraordinary figures, Martin Luther King Jr., a man who dared to dream in a time of nightmares. A man who stood firm when the ground beneath him trembled. A man whose voice, even after death, still calls out to our better angels. His story teaches us something profound. You have the power to rise above fear. You have the power to speak out, even when your voice shakes. You have the power to dream, not just for yourself, but for others. Learning English is more than mastering vocabulary or grammar. It's about understanding the stories that shape our world, the dreams that change nations. And Martin's dream? It wasn't just for America. It was for humanity. So we invite you, not just to remember him, but to live his message. Stand for justice. Speak for the silent. Dream, even when others doubt. And if this story has moved you, if you've learned something, felt something, then share it. Share Martin's story. Share his dream. Let it live through your words, your actions, your voice. And of course, if you believe in learning through stories that touch the heart and inspire the soul, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to WSE True Stories, where English learning becomes an unforgettable adventure. Until next time, keep learning, keep dreaming. And as Dr. King once said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Goodbye for now. Stay inspired. Stay brave.